So there are a couple of things I wanted to talk through today, mostly about your presentations, but I will take 5 minutes to do a mini presentation for you. It's actually a presentation I had prepared previously earlier this year for another venue. And it's not so much about data science specifically, but it's about using the tools we use for designing presentations. So let me go ahead and move this here, and I'll talk through this first. And it was a 5-minute talk when I first gave it, so that should take about 5 minutes and might give you some inspiration for designing a slide deck. And then I will do some practical examples of implementing some of this stuff using the SureEngine package that we're using for doing your slides. And I imagine that all of this will take, I don't know, maybe 25 minutes, something like that. And then we'll have plenty of time for questions. And so I'm happy to work through any kind of what might feel like specific things you have in terms of questions about your project, whether those are bigger picture project management or making your presentation or logistics, or about actually how to do X, Y, Z in R so that you can move forward with your project. So feel free to ask questions, and maybe we'll have you share your screen if it's a very specific question, but we can kind of use this time wisely. And similarly, I'm happy to answer questions about homework for too. So I'm saying this at the beginning so you can kind of think about if there are any questions that come to mind as we go, but I'll start with this mini presentation and then keep going from there. So let's do this. And where's my... Okay, can everybody see this? Great. So I want to talk a little bit about designing a slide deck. So the first thing you want to do when you're designing a slide deck is to pick a technology. And really there are two axes of this, flexibility and reproducibility. And in your case, I have picked your technology for you, which is we're using the SureEngine package, which is basically our markdown based for making slides. The reason why we're here, as opposed to here using Keynote or something like Keynote or PowerPoint, is that we actually want you to continue using the tools that we know are reproducible. And especially because you're giving a presentation that's very heavy on the analysis and your results from it. So it keeps in line with the learning goals of the course. But I do want to be honest that it does make certain things not so flexible. So do not try to worry about trying to fit multiple images on one slide and whatnot, because it is, while it's doing really well on the reproducibility axis, it is not a very flexible system for creating these slides. I think a really important tip for you to keep in mind is that we don't care the number of slides you have. You have 5 minutes to do your presentation, and the number of slides is entirely irrelevant. So you can scroll through them as fast or as slowly as you like, which means instead of worrying about how do I fit 2 or 3 images on one slide, you might maybe put them on separate slides. The next thing you want to do is kind of lay out your content. So what does that mean? You want to start by actually thinking about, if you had like a 1-sentence abstract for your talk, for your presentation, what would that be? You can think about this as that information that I asked you to put on like the info box for your GitHub repositories, for example, and then make an outline for yourself. Now, the important thing about an outline is that you actually, especially with a 5-minute presentation, don't want to show this outline to people. It eats away time to say, I'm going to talk about X, Y, Z, and it's probably going to feel redundant between the presentations that you're going to watch, but it is useful for you as a team to have an outline that you can then, even make this as a slide so you can come back and see at the bigger picture level, and does the flow make sense? But then you can get rid of that before you actually do your presentation. So this is really for your eyes only. Next is kind of have a title slide. So this is where you have your, the title of your presentation. Try to come up with something short that describes your presentation. Your names should be on there. That's your team name as well as your individual names. If you are giving a talk at another venue, like giving another presentation, this is also a great place to have things like your contact information and maybe a link to your slides as well. So with the course presentation, I think the contact information may not be as relevant, but each of you have actually a link to your slides available. So you might as well put that there too. So as people are listening, if they're interested in what you're saying, they can go back and dive deeper as well. And that's another thing that you want to have at the end too. So that's a good way to kind of end things on, having an end slide. It visually remarks to you that that's a time to wind down. And then also it shows your listeners that, okay, we are basically ending things as you're saying, thank you for listening or something. It's useful to have some metadata about your slides there. So that might be like, and you can find our slides here. That's usually a good note to end on. Then set a theme. This actually happens to be my son, and this is by the little forest area by campus, which is basically where we spent much of the lockdown. He was just throwing kind of rocks in there. But you can see that I've actually taken that picture, and that's the theme that I'm working with here. So how do you do that? There's this really cool, there are many of these websites, but there's one of them is the image color picker. So if there's an image that you like, you can actually upload it there, and it'll give you hex codes for the colors that are basically in that image and make a nice palette for you. So that's usually something I try to do when I'm doing presentations. So as I said, it's maybe this is more of a design comment than a data science comment, but I think visually appealing things are useful to put together, especially if you are taking the time to put a presentation together. Thinking about making it visually appealing, I think, is important. We're not going to mark you on your color scheme, so don't worry about it in terms of mark. I'm really mostly trying to give you some tips for making the experience pleasant for you. Another thing you can do, this is, I'm a Mac user, so I know how to do this on a Mac, but there may be a similar thing on kind of other platforms as well. There's a application called Digital Color Meter if you are a Mac user, and you can basically hover over any color on your computer, any image, and it'll give you the hex code for that. And remember that these hex codes are things that we can actually use in our plots and whatnot in R2. So usually what I do is I actually will grab these colors and then regard whatever system I'm working in, either it's Keynote or ShareEngine. These are really the two things that I make slides in nowadays. I use those hex codes throughout kind of my presentation. Another thing, if you're looking for color inspiration, I think this is especially useful for people who are feeling like, you know what, I really don't want to think about colors. It's not my thing. Every year, Pantone, the company, comes with the color of the year. If you're into fashion, you probably know this because that ends up being the color that like walks down the runway that year. But also you'll see, once you know this color exists, you'll actually see it just like in any products that you might see throughout the year. And they actually come up with a palette. So it's not just a single color, but it's a full palette that they have. So I usually will pick like a set of these and then use that for my presentation. So what if you are using a system like Keynote, you can theme things, but we can also do that in ShareEngine as well. So this is something I'll show you kind of as part of the live coding bit as well. But there is a really nice package called ShareEngine Themer, which and I think I'm pronouncing ShareEngine correctly, but don't quote me on it. It's some ninja thing. That's what I know. But there's a presentation on its website. So this themer package is really nice because it basically allows you to just, as you can see in the code chunk there, pick a few colors, and then it will theme your presentation for you. So remember that we're writing things in our Markdown, but the generated document is an HTML document, which is really a web document. So if you know anything about web design, if you've ever made a web page for yourself, you probably know what HTML is, and you probably also know what CSS is, which is cascading style sheets. As part of this course, we are not going to be asking you to learn any sort of web design. But what this package ShareEngine Themer does is if you give it some colors, it creates the CSS file for you, which basically means it will style the rest of your slide. So if you want to stick with the default black and white that ShareEngine has and not change anything, perfectly fine. And you should not at all worry about, you know, like in terms of your grades or anything about that. But if you would like to take a step further and you're the kind of person maybe a little bit more like me where you're like, I hate anything default, I must customize, this might be an easy way for you to do that without having to learn a whole other language or technology. It's really one R package, you pick some colors and then it does its thing for you. Obviously you can customize things further, but you probably don't need to. In terms of styling your slides, you can also pick different fonts. So similarly, using Sure Engine Themer, you can actually give it some font names. So this website called fontpair.co, it's something I use pretty regularly because I like nice fonts, but I'm not very good at picking them myself. So it'll pick fonts that go nicely with each other. So you can use them in your slides as well. Another link, and I'll link to my slides in a repository where these slides live at the end. Jenny Bryan, who actually works on many of the packages that we've been using throughout the semester, has this website of like free photos. So if you want to ever use photos for the purposes of this course, probably doesn't 100% matter where you find your photos, but it is a good idea to get into the habit of paying attention to the copyright information. And especially depending on where you're giving a presentation, it might be that you cannot use copyrighted material. So, but there's lots and lots of places on the web where there's, high quality photos that are Creative Commons Zero license or public domain license, just like anything on Wikipedia, for example. All those pictures tend to be public domain license, so they can be used freely. So there's a bunch of links there. It's at least useful for you to know that this exists, even if you don't end up making any use for it for your presentations in this course. I will mention this package very quickly, that there is a package called Reprex that actually is useful for creating reproducible examples. So when I answer your Piazza questions, I tend to use this package, but it also will nicely style your code. So if you're showing code on something other than a Sure Engine slide deck, it's a useful way of styling your code and then copy and pasting it to a venue like Keynote or PowerPoint, but a little less relevant in the context of our presentation here because we're already using kind of a slide deck that allows for code anyway. Another thing you can do if you actually want to keep going further. So this is really a slide for people who happen to know a little bit of CSS. And if you don't at all worry about it. You can actually, just like in R, we can create variables. You can create variables in a CSS document as well. So you can actually pick a set of hex colors and then give them names and refer to them with those names throughout. This is also something you can do in R too, as in you can give character string names to any color and then refer to those throughout your code if you want to. What you really want to do in terms of your figures is the content of your figures should stand out, right? Like, so if you have a figure on your slide deck, there should be a good reason why it's there and it should stand out and tell a story. But the theme of your figures, it's actually nice to think about blending them in as opposed to standing them out. So this is like a package that I'm not sure that you want to necessarily dip your toes in because it's still in a little bit development stage, but it's, I think, useful to know that it exists at least. And especially if you're looking for something different to play around with, it's definitely a nice package to play around with. It's called Thematic. And what it does is you pick a theme and it basically will theme all of your ggplots with that theme. So if you pick a dark theme, it'll theme them all like dark, for example, based on color choices that you have. So you don't have to manually change colors. What I tend to do is actually instead of using that, just because it's a newer package and I haven't gotten a lot of used to it a lot yet, what I tend to do is I will actually do things like there's that Sure Engine Themer package has some functions for theming a ggplot too as well. So you can basically say, make my ggplots match my Sure Engine theme with this. This cat is not letting me talk. So you could use that. So that's one option for doing things. Or you can actually manually set colors. I think this you've seen a lot on the course slides that I've used, that I try to use a particular color scheme for certain things. So those hex codes that you have for the colors, you can always use them in ggplot functions like scale color manual or scale fill manual. This is something we've asked you to do when we had the web scraping exercise, if I remember correctly, where we ask you to color things red and blue for Democrats and Republicans. So if you have a particular color theme that's running through your presentation and you just want your figures to match it as well, this is probably the easiest way of doing so. All right, so that's about it. If you go to that link at the bottom, that'll end you in a GitHub repository where you can find links to some of the resources I mentioned, whether you use them for your presentations next week or just use it as a reference point for any future presentations. But I think making visually appealing slides can be fun if you have the time for it. But I guess the other part of the story is that they can also be time consuming, especially if you tend to get into this stuff a lot. So I would strongly recommend that you think about content and feel free to stick to the default style and get your content down. But once that's there, if you want to keep going, these are some tools and resources that might be helpful. All right, I'll stop sharing this. I'll see if there are any questions about anything I said so far, and then I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen for doing a little bit of coding for building these Sure Engine slide decks, and then I'll keep answering questions as we do that too. Kitty, I can't see. Can you please move it along? She really only comes when I'm talking on Zoom. Like the rest of the day, she's just sleeping. All right. So let's go ahead and share this other screen. Okay. So what I have here is the project repository for the kind of the fake team that we have on the class that has the what do you call it, the course staff in it. Are you guys seeing my RStudio Cloud window? Is that right? Yeah, okay, great. So this is that repository. So I have pulled all of the changes. I had pushed some changes to your repositories, but many of you have actually gotten to this point anyway, since you've been working on your presentations. You'll see that I added an extra folder, and that's mostly for if you have, as you have like kind of working documents, instead of kind of busying up your main repository, you can put them there. And as I said in the instructions, we're not going to even look at what's there. So don't put anything you want us to see there, but think about it as a place that's useful for you for sharing any sort of code with your teammates or taking notes for yourself. Ultimately, your presentation goes into this presentation.rmd file. So I'll show a couple practical tips for you and then a couple styling tips for you. So one of the things, so let's go ahead and knit this document and see what it looks like by default. One of the things you will see that I have already added to your presentations is this code chunk that says setup, and I've noted it as for better figure resolution. So it has some things like the width of the figures on your page, both in terms of what percent of the slide it takes up, but also kind of the figure width in inches, and then the aspect ratio for width to height. So for any if these defaults don't look good for you, you should feel free to change the defaults themselves. So you can change any of the values here, and what that will do is basically change the sizing of all of your figures for your entire document. But alternatively, sometimes you might have certain figures that you want wider or taller. You can obviously add any one of these kind of options to any other code chunk as well. So if I have a code chunk that makes a ggplot2, say here, I can actually change this and say, no, I want it to be kind of bigger, or I want my aspect ratio to be different. So feel free to play around with those. Those defaults are not a requirement. They're just there to be helpful for you. Another thing that might be useful is this equal is not something I actually added to your default chunk, just because you might want to see your code as you go. But as you're presenting, my guess is you're not going to want to show us a whole lot of code. will take up, you know, can I mute you? Here we go. There we go. Okay. It will take up valuable kind of real estate on your slides, your code. And oftentimes you're probably not wanting to talk through your code, but your content anyway. So you might actually turn this off kind of in the default chunk here. So if you add this here, that will turn off the code. It will not show the code on any of your slides. When might you want to show code? If you have something specific in terms of your code that you want to talk through, say you implemented something a little bit different, or you're thinking that that's something worthwhile highlighting the code itself for a particular point you're trying to make, by all means, feel free to show it. But it's just that I assume that for majority of your presentation, you're not going to be talking us through the code, but instead talking us through your results. Something that might be helpful is that sometimes you might want to show the same figure on multiple slides. So let's go ahead and take a look here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and knit this document, and we're going to take a look at this plots slide. So let's say that you have this figure and you talk through it on one slide, and then you want to actually make the same figure on a future slide as well to be able to refer back to it. Obviously, you can simply copy and paste the same code and then put it on another slide. Like, that's the obvious way of doing that. But then if you modify one and forget to modify the other, that might be annoying. So another thing that you can do is I'm going to add another slide here and say reusing code. So note that the label for this particular code chunk is plot iris. So what I can do is I can insert a new code chunk and say ref label is this. So we're referring to that. And I'm going to, I guess we already turned off the echo at the global level anyway. And then I'm not going to put any code in here. Okay, so let's go ahead and knit this document and see what that looks like. So this was our original plot, and this is basically the next plot. So you can see that they're slightly different because this has different than like default settings, but otherwise we're making the same plot without repeating our code. So if you ever feel like you need to repeat something throughout slides, that might be something that's useful. Another thing that might be useful is that you can actually highlight your output. So say you want to actually draw attention to a particular point in your output. Let's find, so here we go. So I'm going to go to the code slide. And let's say that as you're talking through it, you would like to have this line highlighted. So that would be line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so for that, I would say highlight output. And that's line number 5. And so you can see that, so there are two pieces of output here. So it highlighted the output for both of them, but I can actually separate these and then it would highlight only one of them. This is something that used to be super useful when we used to give talks standing in front of our slides, where it would be harder to go back and highlight it. To be perfectly honest, given that you're going to be giving your presentation sitting down at your computer with your keyboard right under your hand, you can also just literally highlight it as you're talking through something, you know, so you don't actually have to build anything in, but it's useful to know that this is doable. So those are kind of a couple practical things I wanted to talk through. Let's also talk about that Sheringen themer package. So I'll first install that package because I'm not sure if it was installed by default. And I will go to the website for the package so that we can actually take a look at one of the examples. So if we take a look at the reference while that's installing back there at the function reference, you can see that there are various themes that you can choose. So you can pick 2 colors or 1 color. So that's the duo versus mono. And there are some good examples here on the package main web page. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just show you implementation for one of them. So we've installed the package, and I am going to load the package in my document. And what we're going to do is we're going to add a code chunk where we actually, I'm going to go ahead and copy just the contents of this. Actually, I might as well copy the whole thing. Need this here. So this is a mono accent and it has a base color of, I have no idea. So I usually do this. Some sort of greenish color, I suppose. And then it also chose particular like different fonts. So let's go ahead and bring this to the beginning. And I'm going to also, what this does is this actually creates a CSS file. So in order to use this package, you also need to add on top of your document that it's going to use the themer CSS that's generated by this package. So the contents of this, I need to show, that's probably about the fonts. You know what, let me just give up on the fonts for a second. We can install that later. Oh, you still want it, okay. Fine dining. This is always the most thrilling part of anything. It's like watching paint dry. All right, let's try this again. Okay, so you can see that this color kind of changed, right? So we now don't have the black anymore, but things are like themed with this green, for example. So you can add colors like this. We can maybe try to add those fonts too and let it render one more time while we talk through it. But what this package does is it creates this new file, which is a CSS file. So this is the language that we're not necessarily going to be teaching you, but it is used for kind of web programming. And using that R code, it's actually generating this CSS file. And then that CSS file is being used on top of your document. So you don't have to learn this other language, but you can benefit from the fact that that language exists and there's a package that will automatically write it for you. And you just make some choices in terms of colors and fonts, if you would like. I will show one other package very quickly, but I'm not necessarily going to demo it. But there's another package called SureEngine Extra that has a bunch of other stuff. And I think this is mostly, I'm showing it to you to show that like you can do all of this stuff from R, basically, even though we're basically talking web programming at this point. You'll recognize these are things that I use very regularly, kind of on my slides in the videos where I'm showing the code and the output in one place, but you can do a bunch of stuff. I mean, you can have your webcam showing your slides and you can kind of make your slides editable, so on and so forth. Not necessarily things we're asking you to do for your presentation, but just more making you aware that these things exist as an extension of the technologies you're already learning about. The last thing I wanted to mention is that if you go to our course GitHub organization, you'll see that I have a repository here called slides. These are where the source code for my slides are, and I use SureEngine. So if you're ever wondering, oh, I wonder how she did X on whatever video, you can always go and take a look at our markdown code for them. And you can take a look to see how I've done something in particular if you're interested in it. All right. What questions do you have that I can answer about anything we talked about or anything else? In terms of presentation, there are obviously a lot of things you could put. What exactly should you focus on? That's a good question. So I think what you want to focus on, first of all, is you want to kind of think about what is the last thing you want to say in your presentation. Like, we did all of this stuff, and then what did we learn in terms of the research question that we were asking? And it might be that what you learned is that that question, the way you formed it, was not necessarily answerable with your data. So that's fine, and you should be honest about that. But basically think about what is the takeaway message you want to have in terms of your data, and then work your way backwards from that. You should start with a brief introduction to your data set. But when I say brief, I mean actually keep it brief, because you're not trying to teach us how to work with that data set. You're just trying to give us an overview of what the data set is about. So something like, this is where you found it. This is why the data were collected in the first place. Roughly the size of the data set, just so we know whether you're talking about 30 data points or 30 million data points or something in between. If you have multiple data sets, you should kind of maybe have a slide that outlines them. And you could list exactly the number of rows and columns, but more so than the exact number, what we're interested in is what size of data are we talking about. And it's also incredibly important to mention, what does each row in your data set represent? Is it a country? Is it a person? So what is the data aggregated? What level is it aggregated at, if it's aggregated at all? Is useful for your listeners to know so that they can follow the rest of your presentation. The next thing should be some results from your data exploration, so your exploratory analysis. But something to keep in mind, and this is the video I had linked to that was writing advice from the South Park creators, I think says this better than I can, and with more profanity, but they're definitely better than I can, is that you want to not make it sound like it's a chronological like storytelling. Your presentation shouldn't be like, this morning I woke up and brushed my teeth and brushed my hair and then made a histogram and then made a box plot. You obviously did things in a sequence, but instead of giving us the chronological order, you want to show us the highlights. So you may have made 10 plots, pick 2 that are actually interesting, that are relevant to what you're going to say next. But it is useful for us to know, for example, let's say you have some money amounts in your data set. Say it's a housing data set. Are we talking houses that cost 100,000 pounds, or are we talking houses that cost 500,000 pounds on average? These are important things to know. So just some rough notes about your data, along with some visualization or summary statistics. And the rest is really going to vary from team to team. Some teams will move on to presenting modeling results, probably. Some teams will probably keep showing us more data visualization and exploration. Some teams will do a combination of the two. You should ultimately have a final slide where you're summarizing kind of what you said. That's not repeating what you said per se, but summarizing what you said. And if you have comments on things that you think are shortcomings of your work, that's really important to be honest about that as well. So we're not looking for perfection, and we're not looking for what I would call like significant results. We're really looking for depth in terms of your exploration as opposed to breadth. And we're also looking for some honesty about what didn't work. During the lab, if you're pre-recording presentation, so the instructions for next week's lab is going to be, I'll say more tomorrow when you guys are in the workshop, but basically we're going to watch a few of those. So we'll do a watch party so that you can actually give comments on a few of those. So I will organize a particular schedule for them. And then the remainder, you're going to give feedback as part of your last homework. The extra plots you make, they can just go into the extra folder to not be graded. So the ones you don't focus on, yeah, they're just there. It might feel a bit like, oh, was this a waste? It really isn't. It's not. It's where you learn about your data so that you can do better with your actual presentation. If you're presenting live, you'll be presenting at your workshop, and probably you will go like on the earlier end before we do the pre-recordings. But again, that order, I'm actually working on that data, and you'll know at the latest by the beginning of next week, but it will be during your regularly scheduled workshop time. Any other questions for the recorded presentation? You don't have to have your camera on. I think it's nice if you have it, but you don't have to have it on, especially if it's if there's like an internet connectivity issue and whatnot. We want to make sure that we can see your slides, and make sure that things like the fonts are large enough in your slides so they're legible and whatnot. It really might be worthwhile. I have made this mistake at this semester. It really might be worthwhile to record like a mini bit and then just like play it to make sure you're happy with it. You're going to upload them onto this thing called Media Hopper. So those instructions will be in tomorrow's workshop as well. So I think the easiest way to record, unless you have other ways of doing it, is use your university Zoom account and hit record. And then when you're done, it emails you a link, you download it, and then I'm going to show you where you can upload it, which is another university service. If people want to upload it on YouTube or something like that as unlisted, like I'm happy with that too. You can make your own choices. As long as I get a link to a video, I don't really care where it is. But we will give you instructions on using the university available services. You should think about the write-up as a summary of what you discuss. Exactly. So we're not really looking for in your write-up, which goes into your README, like figures or extended discussion. I think the best way to summarize it is an executive summary, and the number of words on it, which is like 750, I think I said, is really about the number of words you might be able to fit into a 5-minute presentation. So you can almost think about it as your script. Obviously, the spoken language is a little different than the written language, but I'm not looking for something very formal writing, because it wouldn't be fair of me to look for that, because we never actually covered writing really like in any sort of depth in this class. We're already having you make presentations, which is not also something necessarily we covered. That's why we're keeping things at 5 minutes, but it really should be like, a summary of what you're talking about, a high level overview, and then any sort of takeaways. So use that part of the assignment to help yourself, as opposed to making it extra work. Use it to basically almost write up a text for your presentation. The code is in a way included in your slides because it's in your presentation or markdown document. And I will actually go in and take a look at the organization of that when I'm doing the marking for the project. But should it be visible on your slides? Chances are you don't want that, because it's probably going to take a lot of space. And also your presentation is not about teaching us how to code, but it's about talking us through your data analysis. So you're probably going to want to have echo equals false in your code chunks in your slides. Unlike my slides, where I teach you how to code, your slides will look more like some of my other slides where I show you figures and talk through the methodology, but not talk through the code. The marking criteria for the presentations, I think I have it there. Let me add that information. So we actually have a grid that we fill out for it. So I can link to that from the assignment instructions, the workshop instructions tomorrow. So it's quite clear to you what it is. So there's no like surprises or anything. It'll be partially about, so the things that we're going to talk about is depth of analysis. Does it look like everyone in the team know like what this data set is about, what they're actually talking about? We are going to be looking to see, have you used the obvious things from the class that you should use to answer your question? So for example, I said not everyone has to do modeling, but if your research question is how can we predict something and you never use modeling, that would be, a shortcoming of, like, that would be something that would be marked down, because we obviously taught you the method for doing it, and why would you not have used it? But if your research question was more an exploratory one and you didn't do modeling, then you wouldn't lose points. So it's not like we have buckets for particular methods that we taught. Instead, it is that we have, we're looking for depth of what you did. We are also going to be looking at things like, did you use your time wisely? So there will be no going over. We actually will stop you at the time. And then also we're going to be looking at, like, in terms of how you've kind of the flow of your presentation, and does it seem like everyone contributed to the work? We can't really judge from the presentation itself. That's why we have the peer evaluations, the real workload distribution. So that's not the goal. So don't worry about every single person has to talk in exactly the same number of seconds, but we want to hear everybody talk during the presentation. Any other questions? And I'm happy to answer any sort of, like, other homework or anything else as well. No, it doesn't necessarily need to. Well, accurately portray the data. The data will be there, but if it's like, if parts of it are not as legible or whatever, that's fine. Yes, you can certainly turn down the DPI, especially, I think I found that, especially if you actually use GG Animate, I think you want to take out that DPI setting, because one of the, I was helping out a student that had that issue. You can turn down the DPI, like, if you think that's what, like, makes it ugly, that's fine. Yeah. DPI is dots per inch, so it's about the resolution of your figure. Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead. Project specific.
Yes. So can I share my screen? Is that okay? Just
yeah.
Oh, sorry, it says it won't let me share. It says it's been disabled.
Oh, hold on. Let's try that.
Cheers. Yes, we've got a project here, and we're trying to calculate, like, things that happen in a row. But we've got, because it's basketball, and we've got, like, shots made in a row. So we've managed to do that here, with, like, there's like the length of the streaks they went on. But what we haven't managed to do is, because obviously these are shots from different games. So we're trying to separate it by, like, game, but we couldn't figure out how to do that, because we had these really long numbers here that aren't actually as streaks. They're just across games. They scored these shots without missing. If you know what I mean?
Oh, I see. So, let's see. So can I take a look at your original, what your data looks like originally?
Yeah. I think it's called. So it says this, we've got all the each one of these is a shot made, or shot taken, sorry. And these are all the variables to do with that. And then we have all the different games here. And say we filter for, like, certain players.
So I think the way you want to do it is, I saw that you're using a function called calc streak.
Yeah.
I think the way you want to do it is you want to use that function in a mutate statement. So create a new column that actually stores that information. But before that mutate, you want to do group by matchup, I suppose.
Group by matchup. Okay.
Yeah, so that it can be calculated for one, like, match at a time, I suppose, or one game at a time. And so what you will probably have is that streak will have repeated observations, like down a row, like up until a streak ends. But that should be the way to do that.
Okay, so you're saying group by match and then mutate a column, and what would the new column be, sorry?
Well, so it's that same function that you were using to calculate the streaks.
Oh, right,
okay, you can use it inside, yeah.
Oh, so you do one streak per matchup then. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. And then you'll have it at that level. I'm quickly looking for a resource. course about this as well. So here I'm going to put a, like, maybe this is useful, maybe not, but I'm going to put it here. But for another resource that I had worked on, there's like, we were looking at something similar, the hot hand phenomenon. So there's some code there in that that might be helpful for you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
You're welcome. With GG Animate, any issues with big data sets? Maybe, there may be. I'm not 100% sure. I think something that you might think about if you have a large data set and you want to have something animated is, can you aggregate it yourself first using dplyr? Because, you know, if it's a huge data set and you're animating it, it may not actually look very good because like the human eye can only follow so much of it. So is there a level at which you can aggregate that to begin with before you animate things? I'm happy to specifically look at code to see if there's something I can help with, but I don't know off the top of my head. I would imagine there may be because it creates so many frames and stuff.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
I just had little sections that had started like breaking off, if you will, and I don't know if it's because the data's so large or whether there's a different number of data points for each frame that it animates. So it's causing a bit of a disjoint in animation.
Right, that might also be the reason that so it may not necessarily just be the raw data size, but instead about like the data continuity throughout the frames that you have. So I can see that being an issue, but I'm happy to take a look at specific code if you want me to as well. I'll show you guys one thing. I'll answer the other questions as well, but I think, let me show you guys this. So I think this was like helpful for somebody else had a question specifically about their project. So here's a way, and obviously we should be using Piazza, but I understand that sometimes with your project, especially, it might be hard to write a question that others may be able to answer. We really have like 1 week left in the course and we don't have anything in person. So I'm trying to be as helpful as I can. Here is something you can do. So let's say that you have some code someplace, okay? In your, so I'm in the R Markdown document, importantly. And you're saying like, why is this not working? Okay, so what I'm doing is I've clicked on the line number that basically brought these 3 dots up. And this line is yellow, you can see, and maybe it's all of this that I want to ask about. So I can actually, I'm holding down the shift and kind of highlighting multiple lines. And then what you can do is you can say, I clicked on these 3 dots, reference a new issue. And then something, give me something informative, because this will come to my email and it's useful for me to get something informative. But feel free to then like tag me and say, can't do blah, need help. Maybe in a nicer way you can say this, okay? But if you take a look at it, when you do the preview, it actually links to the exact spot in your code. So when I'm trying to help out, it really helps me like put it in context what it is. As much as you can, learning to ask generic questions on Piazza is good for you, because once this class ends and you're posting on Stack Overflow, you can't do this. People always want you to ask like your question as generically as possible. So it's an incredibly useful skill. But given that we have a short amount of time and you're, especially if you're like trying out something new, that you feel like maybe only the core staff can help as opposed to other students, feel free to do this and submit an issue. I should get this email and I should be able to get back to you. My inbox is a mess, so you should know that as well. So if I don't get to you, don't take it personally, just ping me some other way as well and I'll get to it. But if you're asking for coding questions like this, I'm expecting to see code linked in this way, just so it's easy for me to understand exactly what you're asking about. All right. We switched the plot save from PNG to SVG. Sure, that's perfectly fine. If you're just using visualizations and not modeling, that is absolutely fine. So again, we're not looking for particular things. That's absolutely fine as long as you're research question isn't obviously, you know, asking for that. So maybe a good way to answer that question, Erin, will be tomorrow during the workshop, and this is true for everybody, think about a 1 minute, 30 second, something version of your presentation that you can actually give to your tutors when they stop by. Like not the whole lengthy thing, but just going through, this is our research question. Here are the ABC things we're going to do. Are we missing something obvious, so that they can give you some pointers? Some research questions if you're missing an obvious thing we covered in class, that would potentially be a ding, but we're not going to be looking for every single person to have done a particular type of modeling. I mean, we have to sit through 65 of these presentations, so variety is what I'm looking for. When trying to make the slides, so those should be dashes that are right next to each other as opposed to with spaces in between them. That might be one issue, Stella, but otherwise, if you want to share your screen, I can take a look, or you can post somewhere, but it should work as long as you're working in a SureEngine document. All right, I'm going to stop the recording.